We have a very small class today, so I may not take a lot of time if there's not a whole lot of discussion. And again, if that, bothers the two of you that are here, you just let me know and we'll stay late, next week or whatever. I never have anybody take me up on these offers. It's one of these things where education is an interesting service because the less you get, the happier you are. I was the same way when I was an undergraduate student. If I came to class, and in those days, we didn't have learning management systems that, you could email people easily. It was sort of the dawn of technology, and professors, you wouldn't know if you had class, if a professor got sick or not until you showed up and there'd be a note on the door that said, Professor Jones is ill today, read chapter 29. And I was just ecstatic at those days when that would happen. I would just think, oh my gosh, I got a free day. I'll go to the movies or do something else than be here. So it's the one service where everybody's happier the less you get. So let's see. I'm going to switch these screens so that we're on the right screen rather than watching the live stream on. And let me make sure that, because they keep changing the sound on this, that we are in fact recording the sound, because I didn't see which of the microphones it was using. Somebody keeps switching it every single time. So let me see if I can just make sure that. Let's see. My channel. And here it comes. Just make sure this is working. All right. Which sounds like it's good. Very good. Good deal. So we talked about employee rights last time in the workplace, and we talked about different senses of rights that you could have in the workplace. Work is often controlled, or usually controlled by others, unless we own our own businesses, which I do happen to own 2 businesses of my own. But even then, you still, in theory, are working for somebody else in that you're working for your clients. And you may have a great deal of latitude, but you're still having to provide a service to somebody else and take into consideration what their needs and wants are. So my family owns a number of bed and breakfasts in Guthrie. We've owned as many as 7. We've sold some, we've started some, sold them off. We have 2 currently. And you have these guests that come and stay, and they're demanding. And I oftentimes tell students one of the things that you have to realize is that there are some customers you don't want. And we learned this very early on. So when we started the bed and breakfast in Guthrie, we were the first one in the state of Oklahoma. And we didn't realize that at the time we started it in 1986. That we were going to be the first, and it's not always easy to be the first. So people would show up in Guthrie and they would come to our house and they would say, well, this is a house. And my brother would say, yes, that's what bed and breakfast is. You're staying in a lovely old house. And they'd say, well, I don't want to stay in your house. I thought this was a hotel. And so we were rapidly going broke, and my mother decided that she had heard that there were some bed and breakfasts on the East Coast that were doing murder mysteries and were very, very successful. And she decided to write one. And then we took out an ad in the Gazette, and she did one. And when we took out the ad, it was called How to Plan a Murder. We became like an instant overnight success. But even though it's her business and she works for herself, we still have to cater to these people that come and stay. And we, in an age in which people have enormous power through the internet, it's tough, to maintain a really good reputation. We have a pretty solid reputation on the websites that review things like, TripAdvisor, that review bed and breakfasts and hotels and other kinds of entertainment and tourism services. So, we have to think about the client and the customer and what they want and what they perceive as being a good value, even though she does, technically not have a boss. She is the boss. we still have to think about what the customer wants, or you'll go out of business if you don't change. One of the things that I can give you an example of how we've had to think about the customer and the client. When we first started, nobody told us that the house that we purchased, there was a family that owned it. Nobody told us that people thought the house was haunted. And our guests started having some experiences, and they would ask if, certain things had happened. We'd come in their room, for example, in the middle of the night, and we said, no, we really downplayed that. And it got to be sort of well known just through word of mouth that the house had these experiences that were similar, that people had over the course of 10 years that we were in business. And we sort of denied it all along. And then finally, at one point in time, Ghost Hunters, which was one of the first shows that was really popular about finding ghosts, contacted us and said, we understand that you have this inn and that people have claimed that it's haunted. And I will tell you that I'm a skeptic. I'm not a big believer in this. And we finally said, okay, well, we'll let you come and do a ghost hunt here. And it's gotten to be wildly popular. Again, we downplayed this for many, many years, but over the course of the years, we have just as many people that are interested in doing ghost hunts and coming to the Stone Lion Inn to stay because they think it's haunted as we do for people who want to do murder mysteries. And it's been an interesting change. We've had to adapt and listen to our consumer. So work is controlled by other people, and we talked about the rights that you have last time. This time we're going to talk about responsibilities. And one of the things that I think is interesting is the Enron case. So years and years and years ago, I asked to teach this class. I asked to teach a course in business ethics. And the dean at the time said to me, our students need substantive skills that they can, let me turn that speaker off. They need substantive skills to go out in the workforce, hard skills that employers are looking for, things like accounting, and we just, don't have time to be teaching what appears to be a discipline that does not have concrete answers to questions. Students in ethics oftentimes tell me that they leave this class with more questions than they have answers after they think about some of these things. And I think that's pretty normal, and it can be very frustrating. Again, going back to what I talked about at the beginning of class, to think that ethics doesn't have proofs like we have in mathematics, the Pythagorean theorem. So I was very unsuccessful in trying to convince the dean that we needed to offer this class. I was teaching legal environment of business and some other courses, the law of commercial transactions. And then Enron happens. So a lot of students, when I ask them if they know what Enron was and how it happened, they're like, yes, I understand. And it turns out that they really don't. So Enron was one of the nation's largest companies. It was once the 7th largest corporation in America, and was trading at $90 per share. And then in 2001, they filed for bankruptcy, and the share prices dropped to almost nothing overnight. And this was followed by a series of other corporate scandals. WorldCom and Tyco followed. What had happened was they were shifting their debt to what were called special project entities, SPEs. These were off balance sheets, and they were funding this debt with stock sales in these SPEs, and it was a house of cards. And when it came out, the whole thing collapsed, and people who were millionaires one day in their 401ks who had all of this Enron stock, the employees of the company, were broke. And it's one of the things that, again, people look at, and really you have to be very careful about how you invest. The way the company was funding their 401k and their matches was through Enron stock. And a lot of those people kept all of their 401k in Enron stock. They didn't diversify their portfolio. So there's sort of two theories with regard to funding your retirement accounts, right? One is that you have diversification of the portfolio, which minimizes what we call microeconomic risk. How does it minimize microeconomic risk? Anybody know by diversification of the portfolio?
You hope if one goes down, the rest are gonna carry.
Yeah, you hope that if you have one, you can get a duck. You hope that if you have one stock that sort of falls, the others, on the whole will do okay. The other theory is that you put all your eggs in one basket. So we say don't put all your eggs in one basket under this theory. You've got to diversify this portfolio. A second theory is, well, let's put all of your eggs in one basket and then watch the basket very carefully. The problem with Enron is that even if people were watching, and there was all of these sort of documentaries that came out on Enron, and they talked to people, and the people were watching the stock on a daily basis, and shouting out numbers in Enron companies, and it was just going, gangbusters, and it all collapsed in this house of cards in almost no time at all. The reason it collapsed was twofold. You had executives at the company who were creating these off-balance sheet liabilities that were going to come home to roost, and you had a top-tier accounting firm named Arthur Andersen that was certifying and auditing and saying that all of this was okay, that this was perfectly acceptable. And it was a shell game. So what duties did these executives owe to the company and to their fellow employees? And does it matter if there's a difference between whether or not you're like the CEO, which was Ken Lay? This was a guy, by the way, Ken Lay was a guy who had a PhD in economics from, I believe, the University of Texas at Austin. He was a bright guy. And his defense was that I didn't know. How do you not know what's going when you're CEO of the company, what your chief financial officer is doing? How do you not know that? And either way, either you're criminally incompetent or you were an active participant. So you were either complicit in this or you were an active participant in it. And you should probably be held liable. And in fact, Ken was going to go to jail. And Ken got out of going to jail. Now, I don't much believe in conspiracy theories, but if I were to believe in one, there are people who fake their own deaths all the time. Literally, there's this woman who's written a book on how to fake your own death. She had gotten into so much debt in student loans that she couldn't seem to find a way out. So she fakes her own death. There are countries that you go to do this, where you can get a death certificate fairly easily and fake your own death. Ken dies right before he's about to go to federal prison and be tried. And as a result of the fact that he dies, and in this country we don't try people in absentia for things like that, his wife got to keep a whole lot of money. I also think that Aubrey may have, faked his own death, and is probably, I say this tongue in cheek, I don't really mean that, but you kind of wonder, what what was good old Aubrey doing? You know, that he crashed into a bridge, you know, on an early morning out in Arcadia. Well, either Aubrey was drunk or Aubrey faked his death out. And again, I say that tongue in cheek, but you know, Aubrey was about to go to federal prison. What kind of duties do these people owe to these corporations? And does it make a difference if you are, say, you know, just a worker bee versus a CEO or a CFO or a chief marketing officer or something like that? I think the answer is that maybe it does. So rights are what is owed to us by others. We talked about this. There are contractual rights, there are legal rights, and then there are what we might think of as moral rights, which is what we primarily focused on. And then responsibilities are what we owe to other people. Generally speaking, rights and responsibilities are oftentimes coordinated. So, for example, I tell students, you have a right to vote. That also means that you probably have a responsibility to vote. We just now found out, we still don't know, after it's been a long time now that we've been going through the election process, and we still don't know which party is going to control the United States House of Representatives. And that makes a difference in terms of what President Biden will be able to do. And it's not just that you have a right to vote, you also need to go and exercise that right. If you don't, and if you aren't an informed citizen, the democracy itself may fail. And that would be a horrible thing to have happen. So a lot of times rights and responsibilities are intimately tied together. So not only do you have a right to vote, but you have a responsibility to vote. You know, do you have a right to have your employer treat you with respect and dignity? Absolutely, but that also means that you have a responsibility to treat others with respect and dignity and extend to them the same courtesies that you want extended to yourself. It's amazing how many people think that we are becoming less courteous and we are becoming less, civil in the modern era. So what are these responsibilities that we owe to others? Well, there's a narrow view of the responsibilities, and it's basically goes back to what we call the agency theory at law. So you have a principal and an agent. The principal is your employer, and you, as the agent, represent that employer. And that employer may be a legal person. Now, again, politicians get into trouble. I've given you this example before when they speak the truth. So Mitt Romney was at a campaign rally, and one reporter asks him, you know, what do you think about corporations and greed and all of these things? And Romney replies, corporations are people, my friends. And everybody laughs. And I've told you this several times, corporations are legal people, right? Now they are not members of the species, but for legal purpose, they can hold property in their own right. They can sue and be sued in their own right. And they exist in perpetuity as long as they have a business going, a business concern going, beyond maybe even what the founders of the corporation would like. Steve Jobs might be horrified today at what Apple is doing. I don't know. One of the things that Steve Jobs said, for example, when he was alive, all of these other companies started coming out with smaller tablets than the iPad. And Jobs said, I'll never do that. You have to have a certain amount of screen property in order to enjoy this product. And as soon as he was dead, what did Apple come out with? Apple was not a company that was market driven. It was product driven. Steve Jobs was going to tell us what was cool. And to a greater or lesser extent, we bought that. How many of you have an iPhone in here? Almost everybody of the 3 students that I have that bothered to come to class today. Almost everybody has an iPhone. Why? I mean, business executives all wanted, I remember when it was introduced, my sister, who's a vice president at Boeing, wanted an iPhone. She didn't want, she had what I referred to, and I kept it for a long time, what I called a Crackberry, which was the BlackBerry. And actually for business, the BlackBerry was a better platform. If you are actually going to use this device for business, the BlackBerry is a better platform because it had a full keyboard that you could, if you can touch type, if you know how to sort of type, you can do that without looking at the device, which my sister would do. It would be horrifying to me. She drives a Cadillac Escalade. She gets a new one every 2 years. And we would be going down, the 635 in Dallas, which is where she lives. She lives in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And when she had this BlackBerry, she'd be, her hands would be through the steering wheel and she would be driving and answering emails on her Crackberry. And you can actually do that while looking. It's hard to do that on an iPhone, isn't it? Because you can't feel where the keys are on the iPhone. But people wanted the iPhone. She wanted an iPhone when it came out because it's cool, I guess. Steve Jobs told us what was cool, and they did that. So these corporations who are legal entities, legal people, can exist well beyond their founders. Steve Jobs ultimately died because he thought he was smarter than the doctors who said things like, Steve, you've got cancer. And he decided he was going to climb a mountain and seek his truth and lay in the dirt, the healing dirt of Chimayo, rather than, take the drugs. And by the time he decided that he needed the drugs, well, it was too late for him. So corporations as legal people are the principal, but they act through agents. Now, according to the legal theory of principal and agent, these are the 3 responsibilities that an agent owes to the principal. They owe a duty of loyalty. What does that mean? That means that you should act in the interest, and this is the most controversial of these responsibilities under the idea of principal agent. You owe a duty of loyalty. That duty of loyalty, though, is fairly narrowly viewed at common law, at Anglo-American jurisprudence. What is the duty of loyalty? Well, it basically means that you shouldn't act in such a way as to have a conflict of interest with your principal. We can think about this in terms of, say, a real estate agent. The real estate agent lists your house, and their loyalty is to put the best foot forward on that house and try to sell the house for as much money as they can and not try to undermine the owner. Now, one way that you could do this, that you could violate this duty, for example, is if you're a real estate agent, you could, for example, say, well, your house is really not worth very much. It needs a lot of work. It's got old bathrooms and old kitchens, and all of that is very expensive. And so, I think your house is not worth very much money. I would list it at, say, $100,000 here in Edmond. there isn't a house in Edmond right now that you could get for $100,000. I mean, or not much of a house in it, right? That you could get for $100,000. Then they could use somebody as a shell buyer to buy it, turn around and get the property and flip it for a huge profit. That would be violation of the duty of loyalty. And I think we can all see how that would be a bad thing. But this duty of loyalty becomes more complex when we're talking about, say, a multinational corporation. A duty of obedience, this one is less controversial. That just means that if your employer tells you you should do something, you should do it unless it violates some sort of moral code or some legal, principle. And then a duty of thrift. That means that you shouldn't waste. Now, why is the duty of loyalty controversial? Well, historically speaking, if you went back in time to say the 1950s and 60s and 70s, corporations were loyal to their employees. I think I've given you this example before. My grandmother was the classified records librarian for Sandia National Labs. There are two big corporations or entities in New Mexico that worked on the nuclear bomb. So my grandfather had been part of the Manhattan Project. They initially moved from Kentucky. He and my grandmother moved from Kentucky, where they were born, to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is where part of the Manhattan Project was being undertaken. And then they ultimately moved to New Mexico. And my grandfather was actually at the first above ground testing. You can go to this place out in the White Sands Missile Range twice a year and visit where they set off the first atom bomb, where they tested the first atom bomb. It's kind of, you go out there and there's this monument and you can still see what the atom bomb did to the ground around that area. There's this glass that it basically vaporized the sand and created this kind of glass around the site where they detonated the bomb. By the way, there was a slight chance, they thought, there was a guy who worked on the Manhattan Project, a scientist, a physicist named Teller, who thought that when they detonated the first bomb, there was a chance that it could end all of life on Earth. It could start a chain reaction and end all of life as we know it. And they did it anyway. Now, I don't know how great that risk was, but think about that. Like, there's a 3% chance. I think that's what Teller figured, was there was something like a 3% chance that the whole thing could go awry. It would start a chain reaction and life as we know it on the planet could end. And they took that chance. That's horrific, isn't it? To think about. And we did it anyway. Then we dropped 2 bombs. The nuclear weapon has only been used twice in history, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And it ended the war. Now we told the Japanese, we've got this weapon and you might want to think about ending. And they basically said no. And so we dropped these bombs. And it created massive destruction. Historically speaking, wars were fought by soldiers, and you tried to avoid as best you could what's called collateral damage. What is collateral damage? Well, it's the annihilation of civilians. When we dropped the bomb, we knew that there was going to be massive collateral damage. So my grandfather worked on this project. He moved to New Mexico with my grandmother. He had started having heart attacks at a very early age, in his 20s. And he ultimately died very early, at the age of 36, from a massive heart attack, right after he had shot a deer up at the cabin that we owned. And the corporation came to my grandmother at the funeral, the president of the corporation, and said, Tunny, don't worry, you have a job. We're going to take care of you. We're gonna make sure you and the kids, my mother and her sister, are okay. And they gave her this job. Now, she was qualified. I mean, she had a master's degree, which was really unusual for women of her age. And she'd been a school teacher, but they gave her a job. The company was loyal to their employees. And she was pretty loyal back. That's pretty remarkable. You think a company would do that today? Go to the widow and say, hey, we're sure sorry, and here's a job. No, you'd better hope that you have life insurance, because the company is not going to give the widow a job, unless she applies for it and works. And in the 1980s, corporations just actively sought to get rid of employees. So if employers no longer have any loyalty to their employees, should employees have any loyalty to their employer? I don't know. Maybe not. And we're finding that employers or employees don't have much loyalty anymore. Generally speaking, let's go through. Generally speaking, employees leave. What's the average tenure of an employee right now? Particularly with unemployment being, I think it's below 3%. 5% is generally considered full employment. If you have 5% unemployment, what you have is those are people that are unemployed briefly while they're looking for a job, or they're switching jobs, they're transitioning between jobs. At 3%, you really have a lot of competition for talent, and people leave fairly quickly their employment. The average tenure is like less than 5 years. I have been at UCO as an employee since before some of you were born. I started here as a student worker in 1994. Huh?
So none of us were born then.
None of you were born in 1994, right?
2001.
Yeah. So I became a graduate assistant in 1996, I think. And then got a full-time position in the equity office as assistant equity officer, like 1999. So before most of you were born. I've worked here for a long time. Why do I work here? Well, one of the things that I have that you all don't and won't have probably is an employment contract. It's called tenure. And it's really, really hard to get rid of a tenured faculty member. When I was associate general counsel, we had a professor who stabbed a student with a pencil, and I tried to fire him, and I couldn't get him fired. They wouldn't fire him. So there's this contractual right that I have. What about, is there a difference between, in this idea of loyalty? I don't think these ideas of obedience, so going back to this, I don't think these are as controversial from an ethical standpoint as the first one. Obedience, if your employer says do something and it's not illegal or immoral, you should do it, right? I mean, when you go into your sales jobs, because you're a sales student, right? And your employer says you need to be spending, 2 or 3 hours a day prospecting, and here's the way we prospect, you should probably do that. That's not that controversial. Now if they're saying things like, you should go out and massacre people, well, yeah, I think, then, that goes beyond the scope of the employment, and you have an obligation to not do that. This idea of thrift, not wasting resources, is another one that I think is less controversial. Although one of the things that we can talk about with this that has become controversial in the modern era with the idea of thrift is something called time theft. Do you know what time theft is? It's doing something while you're at work other than what you're supposed to be doing. Historically, we talked about people, chit-chatting at the water cooler. Now, in the age of the internet, how many hours a day does the average employee spend surfing the internet for cute cat videos on YouTube? Or, watching Fiona the Hippo. Any of you are big fans of Fiona the Hippo? There was this hippo at the Cincinnati Zoo that was born prematurely, and they started a little fan group for her, and you could follow. She's now got a baby brother whose name is Fritz. So there's Fritz and Fiona, and there's all these people that follow Fritz and Fiona on YouTube at the Cincinnati Zoo, post these videos constantly. I think she's the most popular hippo on and she was cute. She was baby animals are generally cute. They're usually, kind of funny acting, and she was certainly funny acting. And the new baby that they've got is certainly funny acting. How many hours a day do you spend doing that? Well, that's wasting time. Now, can you be productive 8 hours a day? So the idea is that you should put in and give your employer 8 hours worth of work for 8 hours worth of pay. Studies suggest that it's really hard for people, particularly if you're doing something that requires thought to do this. It's hard to sustain that sort of level of activity, and your generation particularly is not good at it because you were born in an era in which you had these devices constantly attached. I don't think that this is called a cell phone. I don't think it should be called a cell phone because nobody actually talks on them anymore. Like I had one of the first cell phones years and years and years ago when they first started becoming popular. This was again in 1998, I think, or 90. No, I had it in high school, so it was before then. I must have gotten my first cell phone. It was a bag phone. It weighed something like 12 pounds. It had a whopping 12 minutes worth of talk time. It had 8 hours worth of, you could leave it on without charging it. So it had this huge, massive battery, and you could leave it on for 8 hours. But in terms of actual talking on it, that would run the battery down really quickly. It had literally 15 minutes worth of talk time or 20 minutes, something like that. So you kept it plugged in all the time, and it didn't do anything other than make phone calls. That was all it did. And then they came out with the brick phone. You all have probably never seen these. And then the flip phones, those were really cool. And now we have this device, and I don't know why they call it a cell phone, because we don't actually talk on it. What do we use it for? Oh, I don't know, to get on, surf Facebook, or I don't know what's the latest. Facebook's sort of old and passe now. There was Twitter, which I think now is about to implode and become a non-entity as a result of Elon Musk buying it. They seem to be, in the short amount of time that the guy has owned it, he's done everything he could to ensure that this business goes broke. As far as I'm just fascinated by everybody. He's a genius, maybe, but he's destroying Twitter very, very quickly. So I don't know what the latest thing is that you all find really fascinating. But you're watching YouTube or whatever else it is that you do on your phone. So it's not actually a phone. It's more of an entertainment device now than I'd call it a personal communicator or something like that, because we don't actually talk on the phone. Your generation doesn't want to talk on the phone. My generation loved to talk on the phone. That was a big deal for kids to have their own line. That was a huge deal when I was growing up. If your parents got you your own, because phones were expensive. It was expensive to call from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. It was long distance when I was a kid, and it was something like $1 a minute to call from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. So if you're on the phone, you could run up a pretty big phone bill very quickly. So you're doing all these things and that's called time theft. Now, the reason I point this out is because studies show in psychology that it's hard for people to sustain mental activity for very long. It's one of the reasons that going to college is hard, because you have to sustain mental activity for a long period of time. And not everybody is good at keeping your attention. You know, what do? I walk around the room, I give you ducks, I ask questions, I change the tone and inflection of my voice to try and make sure that you're still with me. And it's hard, you know. Did I tell you all the story about when I first started teaching? So I started teaching, and the people who were my professors became my colleagues. And what one of my professors said to me, you know, during the first semester, did I tell you all this story again? So he said, you can tell whether or not you're going to have a good class or a bad class in 5 minutes. I've told you this story, right? Yeah. Okay. So the good class, you'll walk in and you'll say, good morning, class, and they'll repeat back to you, good morning. And if it's a bad class, you know, that's a bad class. They'll repeat, you know, good morning. If it's a good class, there will be silence and they'll write it down. You know, students don't write anything down anymore. It's amazing to me. I used to fill notebooks up with notes. And now it's like, you know, I mean, people show up, they don't take notes. I don't know what they do. But anyway, it's hard. It's really, really hard to sustain this kind of mental activity for long periods of time. Now, one of the things that makes it easier, I think, for the discipline that I teach in, which is sales, is that sales is such a dynamic discipline that there's always something going on. It's not the same every single day. It's you're going and you're meeting new people and you're having to find solutions for them. And so it's interesting. And it's generally not done, you know, by sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day crunching numbers like an accountant. I can't think of anything more boring than being an accounting student. I mean, it was like torture to have to take that class in college for me, because it was so boring, you know, whereas sales is fun. Professional ethics also play a role in this. The learned professions, which there are three that were originally the three learned professions, and that's what colleges and universities started out around, were these three learned professions. The oldest of the learned professions is theology, it's the church. That's the way most universities started, was as a way of transmitting knowledge to the clergy, to train people to be priests historically. So the oldest is theology, then law was the next oldest one. And of course, this corresponds with, you know, sort of, at the time, it went along hand in hand with theology, because law and the church, the state and the church were inextricably entwined for most of human history. And then the third profession was medicine. All of these have detailed. The Code of Professional Responsibility for attorneys is very, very, it's a whole, you know, sort of big book that most states have adopted. It's called the Model Rules of Professional Responsibility, and almost every state has adopted these. And they have not only the rules, but there are all the commentaries that go along with the rules and understanding the rules and why we have the rules, how the rules developed. The medical profession also has these, but now other professions are starting to do this. There is in public administration an ethical code that public administrators are supposed to follow. And we're now starting in sales to see a movement towards developing these kinds of things. So the ethical codes, I think the thing that's interesting here is what happens if these ethical codes conflict with one of these three duties of loyalty, obedience, and thrift. As a lawyer supposed to, and as a lawyer, I can't. If my client tells me to do something, and I had a client who did this, and I would have to say things like, no, Jeff, I'm not doing that. So I went very briefly for 5 years into the private sector, and I worked for a corporation called the American Education Corporation that manufactured learning management systems for the K-12 market. And we had these people that were using our trademark. And so I sued them. I mean, they were using, our trademark was an A+, and they just could not believe it was a big red A+, and why did we have that as our trademark? Well, historically, it was kind of like that. Historically, and it was in red. Why would we have that? Well, because an A+ was like the highest grade you can get. And in law school, there isn't a 4-point scale. So here at the undergraduate level, we have a 4-point scale, which means that there isn't really a difference between a 100 and a 90. And when I was in high school, I had this friend and he and I would compete and I would always beat him. And he would say, why do you care? He's like, I got a 90. That's an A. In high school, we actually had a 5-point scale. If you took college prep courses, if you took the advanced courses, they were worth 5 points instead of 4. But 4 points is 4 points, whether it's a 90 or 100, there isn't a big difference. But if you have a 12-point scale, so in law school, an A+ is worth 12, an A is worth 11, an A- is worth 10, and so on and so forth. And you go down until you get to no points. So it does make a difference. Well, this company called A+ Math is using our trademark. So I sued them and they couldn't believe that we had a trademark on this, and we did. And I sued them in federal district court in Oklahoma, and I could not believe this. This was sort of an amazing case. This was in 2005. So you all were born in 2005, right? You were probably really, really little. So there's this company out there that's using our trademark called A+ Math. And they had a program. This guy was a programmer, and he'd written a little program, and it was to basically tutor kids in math as a tutoring, and he called it a learning man. It wasn't really a learning management system. It was just sort of a math practice program. And I sued him and in federal district court, and the case got assigned to a judge who was about to take senior status. So he was trying to clear his docket. Senior status is where judges, basically you're still called judge and you're allowed to keep your chambers and you're allowed to keep a law clerk, and they assign cases to you if they need you. If there's like a huge heavy caseload, they might assign 1 or 2 cases, but he was about to retire, take senior status. And these people filed a motion claiming that our long arm statute didn't apply because they hadn't sold any product in Oklahoma. And I was like, it doesn't matter that you sold product in Oklahoma or not. Your internet is searchable in Oklahoma. Well, the federal judge agreed with them. He agreed, but in my response to their motion to dismiss, I said, even if you do this, what you should do is you should transfer this to another district, that the defendant resides in. And so the judge did that. He didn't throw out my case totally, but he transferred this to the Eastern District of Virginia. And my boss is like livid. He did not understand the way the world worked in many respects. I don't know how he became an executive of a publicly traded company, because I went in and I told him, I said, I've got bad news. The judge, he's like, you should have gone down there and had lunch with that. And he used an expletive that starts with G, it's 2 words. That expletive judge, and told him that this is unacceptable. And I'm like, Jeff, that's not the way it works. That's called an ex parte contact, and it's illegal. An expletive, that's exactly the way it works. This is politics. And I'm like, federal judges generally think that they're above that, right? I mean, like, I was like, I don't think you understand, Jeff. Federal judge here, I'm here. And you are, because you're not a lawyer, are here, right? Like, That's not the way this works. And he just didn't get it. I mean, he told me, you know, you're gonna go down there and fix this. And I said, there's no fixing this. It's done. He transferred this case sua sponte to the Eastern District of Virginia, where the defendant resides. And he was just madder than hell. Well, I have this duty of obedience to but I have something called the rules, and I'm like, here's the rule, Jeff. I mean, you can fire me, but this is the rule that says if I did this, I could be disbarred. You know, and here's the cases where they've disbarred lawyers for doing this. You don't do that, right? That you don't have ex parte contacts with the court. So what happens when we have these conflicts between these professional responsibility codes? Which one what wins out? Well, with regard to at least the law and with regard to medicine, it's going to be the code, because those are licensed professionals. Now, it's less clear if we start developing codes, for example, for salespeople, because there isn't necessarily going to be an enforcement mechanism for this, the way there is in the law. The law is, it's called the Supreme Court of the state of Oklahoma is going to take your license away. Or the Western District, where I'm licensed to practice law, is going to revoke your law license. And when they revoke your law license, they notify the Oklahoma bar that your law license has been revoked, and they revoke your license, right? I mean, bad things happen to you when you don't follow these. Another consideration is, what are the responsibilities in a corporate versus a non-corporate? So the vast majority of you will work in non-corporate settings, maybe. You know, historically, people went to work for big corporations like GM or Ford or something like that. The vast majority of you will work for mid-size or small companies. Is there a difference between that? I think there is. Because, you know, it's a more personal and intimate contact that you're going to have with these people with regard to these three duties that you have, these three responsibilities. Whistleblowing. This has become very controversial because of corporate scandals like Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco. And the way Enron sort of imploded was you had this employee who went and told people, like, they're doing this and it doesn't seem to be kosher. I will tell you that when you become a whistleblower, things generally don't work out well for you. People generally don't want to hire you after you've done this. So what do you have to have if you're going to be a whistleblower? Well, the text suggests that first of all, you have to have a real threat. What is a real threat? Well, in the case of Enron, it was using these, you know, off-book sort of accounting principles, loopholes, what we might call loopholes in the accounting, to create an illusion that something has more value than it does. That's a real threat. So you have to have a real threat. There's a difference between, you know, like this real threat and maybe a hypothetical threat or a very, you know, attenuated threat. The second thing you have to do, what would be a attenuated threat? Well, in the case, for example, of, you know, my boss telling me that this is what I was going to do, and me explaining to him calmly and collectedly that that's not what I was going to do. Should I then go out and alert the news media, for example, that, you know, he's done this? Well, no, probably not. You have to seek to prevent harm through internal means. So what I did is the only person in the company that he really respected was the CFO. So I went to the CFO and I'm like, Neil, this is what Jeff wants me to do, and I'm not going to do it because I'm not going to risk my license to practice law And he's like, no, he's like, I'll explain it to him. And he explained it calmly and softly to Jeff, you know, that was not what we were going to do and the reasons why we weren't gonna do it. And, you know, he sort of accepted that. So working through internal means. This goes along with the doctrine of exhaustion. You have to exhaust those before you go public and run to the media. You have to exhaust all of your remedies. This happens a lot, you know, in employment law cases where employers offer progressive discipline and employees just run to the EEOC and sue. You can't do that. You have to exhaust all of these sort of internal procedures. Otherwise, the EEOC is going to look at you and say you don't have a case, right? So the doctrine of exhaustion. So what do we know, basically, in conclusion, is that with rights, you usually have responsibilities. That work is something that's controlled by others and is full of these ethical pitfalls. How can we, in an age in which employees really don't have much loyalty, how can we maybe encourage that or foster that? Well, that's where this idea, and I've talked about this before, of living the brand comes in. While employers no longer have, you know, much duty to employees, what we have found is that you can fire people, and the research bears this out, for any reason or no reason except the wrong reason, right? That's what the law is. You can fire people for any reason or no reason except the wrong reason. What's the wrong reason? You're Black, you're Asian, you're Jewish, you know, you're a Democrat. You can't fire people based on these kinds of arbitrary things. And those are very difficult to prove. But what we found is that companies actually do better if they sort of contractually agree to create things like loyalty between the parties. How do you do this? Well, actually giving employment contracts gives people stability. It gives them an incentive to continue to work for you. And you can engage in this, what we call living the brand, which is what Southwest does. You recognize that people have these human needs and you respect that. And yes, you can fire employees for any reason except the wrong reason. But when you do that, you risk a lot in terms of what it takes. If you fire, for example, a salesperson, last time we talked about this case where a salesperson is fired and their manager gets their commission, how long does it take you to train somebody new to fill that role, and how much money are you losing during the time that you're doing a search? I mean, hiring employees and onboarding is an expensive proposition. So yeah, you can fire people all you want, but when you do that, it comes at a cost. And companies have started to recognize this. After the 1980s, when this became popular to look around and say, fire the old guys, which you can't do because we've had something called the ADEA, Age Discrimination and Employment Act. If you do that, you lose out on a lot because it's over the long haul going to, in many instances, cost you more than it does to retain employees and keep them. It's one of the reasons why employers now, after the 1980s, when this became popular, now want to become on Forbes, you know, lists of best places to work. Because yeah, you can fire people, but how much is it going to cost you to replace them? Any questions? Nope. All right. Well, I will see you next Tuesday and we'll continue on. I did not get your exams graded because I had one student that needed an extension for a very legitimate reason. And I think I told you all, I grade all of the exams at one time so that if I'm in a good mood or a bad mood, that doesn't, you know, impact, it shouldn't impact grades because I use a rubric anyway, but, you know, I mean, there are human frailties inherent in everything. So, okay. I will stop this and